Welcome everybody to Prime the Pump podcast. I'm Brent Hudson, teaching pastor at Journey Church. I'm here with Pastor Dave, and we want to just share a little bit about the message this weekend. Dave, how you doing?
You know, I'm doing well. I'm just wondering, Brent, if people panicked because last week we didn't drop the ball, but because it was a guest speaker, we didn't do this Prime the Pump, which is still a pretty new initiative for us.
That is true. I missed it though, Dave. I went looking and realized, oh yeah, right, we didn't do one last week. It was
and maybe all the incredible number of followers who are now really looking forward to this were maybe deeply disappointed. I hope they weren't too stressed out about it.
No, exactly. And by the way, press the like button. Give us some encouragement as we continue doing this. It's always great to get a little feedback. So that's great. So Dave, what are we actually looking at this weekend? We're still looking at Jacob and looking at his life and how God used this very imperfect person to do incredible things. What are we actually going to dive deep into this weekend?
Well, it's really, again, a really big part of our life, and it's called work. One of the facts I was reading as we're prepping for this message is that when a person starts working, say, in their young adult life, 16, 17, to the day they retire, maybe in their mid-60s, people work 88,000 plus hours over that time. And, of course, we think about people who are also raising a family and doing all of the, housework, homework and all that. It's even more hours. So work is such a big part of all of our lives. And I love this story around Jacob because I think we see a lot of the things that make work feel good, and when work feels bad. I think Jacob's story helps us to identify some of those things.
Yeah, I love that phrase in the story of Jacob where it says that now he makes this deal with Laban, of course, to pay the bride price for Rachel, who he loves. And it says like the years went by like a couple of days because, he was in love, right? And I just loved reading that because it was, I guess that it contrasts so much with the second 7 years of it, so there's this idea I think we're going to talk about when work feels good, right? When work is good. And we see that Jacob, he did 7 years of service, of work, labor, and it felt like a couple of days because everything was lining up. Everything was going up and to the right, as they say. He was achieving his goals and making his mark. And it was a joyful opportunity for him to pay that forward to get his bride. So it's a great story. It's just in one line, right? But it says so much about how work, when everything's going right, can be a fantastic thing and not a problem whatsoever. It's great.
Right. And of course, I also think, though, where we can really resonate with this story of Jacob when we reflect on it and read it is that Jacob also has another season where work is not feeling so good. There are challenges with his father-in-law, who was essentially his boss. There were struggles around wages. There was, let's be honest, there was a sort of a conflictual work environment that he had to deal with. People weren't trusting one another. And again, I think that we all know that when we think about the complexity of work out in the world, there's so many people that are getting up every week and they're in maybe a difficult season, maybe they're in a difficult job. And again, how do we navigate that? And how do we, face that? And so I think that's also part of the work story that we have to talk about in the context of faith.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people who have their Laban stories, right? I mean, Jacob worked for his father-in-law / uncle Laban, and he was a very deceptive guy. I mean, he figured that out on his wedding night, of course, first and foremost, but all along the way as well, we learn in the story, like you say, his wages were changed. And then, of course, we have the story where Jacob makes a deal with Laban for a certain number of sheep, the spotted and striped or sheep. And then he goes and takes all those sheep from his flocks and sends them away with his son in a faraway place so that Jacob doesn't have access to them. So, I mean, I think there are a lot of people who have experienced work that way, where the person who is, over you, your boss, so to speak, has not been on your side, has not been fair, has not been kind and good and investing in you, but rather has been just, almost abusing you. Well, actually abusing you in that case. And work can, just the experience of work can be brutal for some people in certain seasons of their life. What I find interesting, though, is that it's the same work. The first 7 years, Jacob did shepherding and did all the work. And the second 7 years and beyond, he did shepherding and all the work. It was the same work. But yet the experience of that, one was fantastic in like a few days, and the other was brutal and disheartening.
And of course, what we really also want to remind people in the story of Jacob is how still there was this sense of God was involved in this work in really profound ways.
Absolutely.
And I think that's one of the things we want to remind ourselves, that, that there is this both hope that we can have when we do our work, that God is at work in and through us and in those working circumstances. And then I'm getting all choked up talking about this, but and also at the same time in this story, we see that God, I think, opens up doors for us to come to work in creative ways where there are new approaches and new solutions, and that again helps us to come to work in a way that we bring our faith to our work. We don't leave it at the door, so to speak.
No, absolutely. And Jacob, even in the midst of this very difficult season in his life, where his work was really not rewarding him, he was still, and it says in the passage that in a dream, God spoke to him about how to deal with this. And you see God working in the midst of these difficult years of Jacob's life. And, that reminds me of something we were talking about a little earlier, Dave, off camera. How Jesus talked about the narrow path, and it was hard, and that the easy way is broad and whatnot. And there does seem to be a connection a little bit with our own personal spiritual development and experiencing some adversity, experiencing some struggle along the way where we have to make hard choices and actually determine in our lives what is really important. And I think that when we see God working in Jacob's life during this difficult season, it gives all of us a bit of hope that, sometimes God does his greatest and most profound work in our lives when we're having a bit of a rough time maybe. And the key is to keep our eyes open and our hearts open to seeing what God is doing all around us, because we can be overwhelmed. I mean, Jacob could be overwhelmed by his change in pay. Jacob could have been overwhelmed by the dishonesty of his father-in-law. But at the end of the story, what we see is Jacob had a dream where God spoke to him, and he grabbed a hold of what God was doing, and he went in that direction in his life instead of being overwhelmed and perhaps even destroyed by the rough things and difficult hardships that he was experiencing at that time. So it's a very interesting, cool story that actually gives us a bit of hope if we happen to be in a season where our work seems to be a little tough and difficult presently.
Well, Brent, I'm going to look forward to doing this preach, and as we all think about work in the context of faith in God and turning our work into an extraordinary moment.
All right. Well, God be with you this weekend, Dave, and then we will be back here again for Prime the Pump next week. Till then, God be with you.
Take care.